Welcome once again to our channel, wherein your teacher, Jayson Patalinghug, will give you a virtual lecture on our subject, Creative Writing. Okay, so previously we discussed about the different elements and structures and form of poetry. This time, we will be focusing on writing poems. So, I know you are very excited and you are now asking question as to how do I start writing my very first poetry? Okay, but before we go to our discussion for this week, I would like to congratulate the following students for winning a 100 pesos worth of load cards. First, Rhea Fee Bermoy, grade 11 Pythagoras, an ABM student who won a 100 pesos load card for TikTok dance presentation. And Keith Danriv Villapania, a grade 11 section format, a student of Humanities and Social Sciences who won 100 pesos worth of load cards for being the top contributor of the month in our FB group page. Now, the 100 pesos worth of load cards is sponsored to us by the province of Agusan del Norte. So thank you very much, province of Agusan del Norte, for sponsoring our load cards. Okay, so now let us go to our main discussion for this week. Again, our learning competency is to write a short poem applying the various elements and literary devices, exploring innovative techniques. And by the way, this lecture is based on the learner's activity sheets written by Charlene S. Galea and edited by Mr. Ryan Paigna and Mr. Leo Wilfredo Gapas from the division of Agusan del Norte. Now, the specific objectives for our lesson this week are the following. First, to identify the various elements, literary devices of poetry. Second, to share insights based on the poem read. And third, to write a well-crafted poem. Okay, in the third objective, this is where we're going to focus. To write a well-crafted poem. Now, when we write a well-crafted poem, I know you will be asking questions like, what are the things that I am going to consider in order to write my own poem? And how do I start? Now, before we start our poetry writing, or before we start writing our very own poem, we have to review first. I know I already discussed this in a previous video, but I wanted to review this for the sake of remembering and for mastering the different elements of poetry. Because you cannot write a poem without mastering the basic. Okay, when you write your poetry, you have to consider its form. You have to decide what would be the form of my poetry. Okay, what are the different forms anyway? Would you like to write a narrative poetry? Okay, a narrative poetry is a type of poetry that narrates a story. You might want to narrate your own story or the story of other people in your poem. Okay, there are two kinds of a narrative poetry. First, we have a ballad. A ballad is a poetry that recounts a tale of ordinary people. Okay, people who are just people. Ordinary people like you and me. Usually, ballad focuses on love themes or stories about love. Okay, so again, we are focusing on recounting or telling a story of ordinary people. Well, the next type of a narrative poetry is an epic. Now, an epic recounts a tale of heroes and legendary characters. Now, it depends to you on What kind of poetry would you like? If you like it to be narrative, whose story are you gonna tell? Are you gonna tell stories of ordinary people, which is a ballad? Or are you gonna recount stories of legendary characters and heroes? Okay, so it depends on whatever you're going to choose when you start writing your poem. Or probably you would like to write a lyric poetry because you are too emotional and you want to express your thoughts using poetry. Okay, so a lyric poetry is a type of poem that expresses a strong thought and emotion. Okay, that's why if you are into emotion, then you might want to write a lyric poetry. Now, there are different types of lyric poetry. The first one is the ode. When we talk about ode, it is a poem written in order to praise or to exalt a certain person. It could be an important person to you, the one that you idolize, or the one that you look up into. So this might be the time to write an ode to them. Okay, remember telling them of how good they are, how you idolize them, and what are their good qualities, exalting them into the pedestal. That is an ode. Or you might want to be very sentimental. Okay? Elegy. An elegy is a poem written to mourn the dead. Okay? You might have known someone who passed away recently and you wanted to immortalize them by recounting their good deeds and lamenting the reason of their death. And at the end, we're going to give a conclusion that even though they died or passed away, they will be immortalized in our heart. Okay, so that is an elegy. Again, an elegy is a poem written to mourn the dead. The next type of lyric poetry is a sonnet. A sonnet is a poem written in 14 lines in which the theme revolves around love. Now, there are three proponents of sonnets. Okay, whichever you would like to follow. We have the Spenserian sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnets, and the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnets. Okay, I have already discussed this in my previous video. You might want to review that one in order for you to decide as to what kind of lyric poetry would you like if you decide to write a lyric poetry. Okay, if you're not into emotional type or you're not too sentimental, you might want to write a descriptive poems. Descriptive poems are not too emotional, but it uses vivid words to evoke the different senses of human being. A descriptive poetry is a poem written to describe the world that surrounds the speaker, using elaborate imagery and adjective. Okay, you might be feeling happy. Okay, you're in a beautiful place on top of the mountain perhaps, and you like what you see and you start to describe everything that you see around you. In my previous video, I gave an example of a descriptive poetry, all things bright and beautiful. Okay, all things big and small. Okay, if you remember that. Okay, so you might want to write a description of the beautiful surroundings where you are right now. Okay, so you might want to write a descriptive poetry. Now, there are other forms of poetry. Okay, other than the populars that I have shared to you a while ago. Okay, the other form of poetries are as follows. Number one, haiku. It is popularized in Japan. This is a very short, emotional poetry, but it is metered. 5, 7, 5 syllables. Okay, a haiku is composed of a tercet. When I say tercet, it has 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables. Second line, 7 syllables. Third line, about 5 syllables. Okay, so you might want to write a haiku. Very small or very short. Very short. However, you have to take into consideration the number of syllables in every line. Usually, it has something to do with the season, okay, or the everything that you see around you. And it could be a descriptive at the same time emotional because it's too personal. Okay, haiku is written using a very personal approach. But once again, it's very easy. It's only a tercet, but it is composed of a specific number of syllables. Okay, you might want to start writing your own haiku. Next is a limerick. Now, a limerick is a very structured poem. Okay, if a haiku is a tercet, limerick is composed of 5 lines or a cinquain. It is usually humorous. Okay, you want to write a poem that is funny, okay, full of humor. Okay, and it's very short. It's only 5 lines or a cinquain. Another form of poetry that is very popular nowadays, especially the modern poetry, is the free verse. What makes it popular is that you are, as the writer, is not bound for rhymes and matter. That's why many writers want to start writing using a free verse. It is a poem written without a specific rhyme scheme and matter. Okay, another form of poetry that you might be interested into is a blank verse. Blank verse is like a free verse. It does not have a specific rhyme scheme. However, it follows a specific matter. Usually, it is written in a iambic pentameter. Now, once you have decided what form of poetry would you like to write, you have to consider now or choose carefully the words that you are going to use in writing your poem, because you are going to consider imagery. Now, imagery makes the poem powerful and enticing. What makes it powerful is because when you use words to draw mental pictures in the mind of your readers, you are actually giving life to your imagination. So that is why imagery is very important. And you can achieve imagery if you can carefully choose the words that you're going to use so that they can evoke the senses you want to evoke. In order for you to, in order to help you achieve that, you might want to consult the dictionary, or you might want to read a lot of poems and gain inspiration from them. Next thing that you have to consider when you write your very own poem are the rhymes and rhyme scheme. This is something that I love in writing poetry because I have to specifically look for words that rhymes. Rhymes are the repetition of similar sound at the end of the line, while rhyme scheme is the pattern in which the end rhyme occurs. Okay, it's very easy. Okay, it's very easy for me. I personally like it because it gives the poem when you read it, it makes it beautiful, especially when the sound rhymes. So it gives beauty, a sound, a beauty of sound in your poetry. I'm sorry, I think I'm lost there for a moment. I apologize for that. Okay, going back. Okay, rhymes usually are found at the end of every line. And the pattern that you are going to make in every stanza, those are called rhyme scheme. Next is poetic meter. Okay, so when you write a poem, you have to consider the poetic meter. Or if you would like to disregard that because you want to write a a free verse, then it's up to you. But it is better that you practice writing a rhythmic structure, okay, of a line within a poem. It's a good exercise of the mind, and of course also your vocabulary. In order to achieve poetic meter, you have to carefully choose words and decide how many syllables you're going to allocate in every line, and what would be the rhythmic pattern you wanted to create by deciding the stress in every syllable. Would you like it to be an iamb, a trochee, a dactyl, or a spondee? It depends on your creativity as a writer. Next are lines and stanzas. So lines and stanzas makes a poem and not a prose. Because if you're going to write a prose, you'll be writing sentences and paragraph. But in poetry, you're going to carefully identify the number of lines and the number of stanza. So you have to decide how long would be my poem. Okay, how long do I want it to be? Okay, I would like to have a poem of one stanza only, or two stanzas, or three stanzas, or four stanzas, or even 100 stanzas if you want it to be very, very long. And how many lines would there be in every stanza? Okay, a line is a unit of language into which a poem is divided, and a stanza is a series of lines grouped together. If you remember in our previous lesson, if there is only one line in the stanza, that stanza is called a monostitch. If there are two lines, it's called couplet. If there are three lines, it's called a tercet. If there are four lines, it's called quatrain. And if it has five lines, it is called a cinquain. If it has 6 lines, it's called a sestet or a sexain. Okay, so on and so forth. I would like you to remember that lesson in our previous video. Okay, later on, we're going to give you an example of a poem, and then we're going to analyze it together. That would be in the part 2 of this lesson. The next thing that you are going to consider when you are going to write a poem is the tone and its mood. What is a tone? A tone is the attitude of a writer takes towards the subject of the poem. Okay, what would be your attitude towards the subject of the poem? What would be your subject anyway? First, you have to identify what's your subject. Example, love. Your subject is about love. Then what is your attitude towards love? Are you bitter? Or are you celebrating love? Okay, that would be setting a tone to your poetry. You have to identify what would be your tone. And the mood is the effect. Okay, what would be the feeling that it evokes or it creates in a reader? So they are related. The mood is dependent on the tone. If the tone is bitter, you are bitter towards love, then the feeling that it creates to the reader is also bitter. it could not be opposite, not unless the reader misunderstand the the meaning and the emotion of your poetry. Next thing that you have to consider is the literary device. Now, there are different or multiple or many kinds of literary devices in literature, but we are only focusing into a few in this subject. Okay, first we're going to consider the sound device. Now, the sound device makes your poem beautiful, because remember that poetry is meant to be read aloud. So the more beautiful the sounds are, the more beautiful your poetry will be. Okay? An example of a sound device is an alliteration, wherein the initial sounds on the same line or stanza is being repeated. Again, the initial sounds on the same line or stanza is being repeated. That is an alliteration. Example for alliteration is as follow. Okay, I'm going to read to you the example. Camilla's cute, colorful collar. Okay, remember, the initial sound is being repeated in every word in that line. Camilla, cute, colorful, color. Okay, so that is alliteration. Next is assonance. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sound. Okay, the vowel sound is being repeated anywhere in the middle or at the end of the line or stanza. Example, chilling while having chit-chats and eating chips. So the sound E is being repeated either in the middle or in the beginning of every words in that line. Next is consonance. Now, consonance is the repetition of consonant sound. Okay, again, anywhere or in the middle of the stanza. That's only the difference between assonance and consonance, is that assonance is repeating of vowel sounds, the repetition of vowel sounds, while consonance is the repetition of the consonant sound. Example, Mandis is prettier and better with Peter. The sound t, t, t is repeatedly used in several words in a specific line. Prettier, better, and Peter. The next sound device that is very effective in writing a poem is called onomatopoeia. It is an imitation of sound using words. Example, boom, clap, clap, roar, ding dong, or tick tock, bzzz. Okay, so those are different sounds that we imitate using words. And when you use that, you are actually using onomatopoeia. If you're gonna use these sound devices in your poem, I'm gonna tell you, your poem will rock as long as you effectively use these sound devices. Now, after sound devices, of course, there are different figurative language that we use, okay, or we are going to use in our poetry, and you have to take into consideration which of these figurative language are we going to use in our poem. The first is simile. This is very popular. Simile is the comparison of two things using words like or as. Okay, as I have given to you an example in the previous video, you're going to say, you are beautiful like a flower. Okay, so you compared you and flower using the word like. Okay, so similar to simile is metaphor. However, the only difference between simile and metaphor is that metaphor uses a direct comparison of two objects without the use of like or as. You're going to say, you are a rose. Okay, instead of saying you're beautiful like a rose. Okay, there's no like. You immediately tell the person that she is a rose. So that's an example of a metaphor, a direct comparison between two objects without the use of like and as. The next figurative language that is commonly used in poetry is hyperbole. Hyperbole is the use of exaggeration to lay emphasis. When you're going to exaggerate words, example, you're going to say, I cried a river of tears. So imagine not just many tears or a huge amount of tears, but a river of tears. So that is an exaggeration because that cannot be true. You are only exaggerating in order to emphasize your feeling or a specific word that you want to emphasize in a specific line. Okay? Next is anaphora. Anaphora is the repeated use of words at the beginning of two or more consecutive lines. You keep on repeating the same words. Usually it also used to create emphasis on a certain line or certain word in that certain line. Next is personification. Personification is something that gives your poem a very complicated effect because you're going to give life or give human characteristic to a non-living object. Okay, again, personification is when you are giving a human characteristic to a non-living object. Remember my example in the previous video? I said the wind whisper into my ears. Now the wind is a non-living object, but you give it a human characteristic. It whispers. Okay, whispering is a human characteristic that we gave to the non-living object, which is wind. Okay, if you are using that in your poem, you are using the figurative language called personification. Next is antithesis. The antithesis is almost similar with irony because usually it is the opposite of the words in closed placement. Okay, so I would like to give a separate review on the different figurative language so that I can give more example in a separate video. The next thing that you are going to consider when you are going to write your poem, of course, you have to decide what would be the theme of my poem. Okay, you have to carefully choose the theme of your poem because you cannot write something without a unified theme. Now, the theme is the underlying message that the writer wants to convey in the poem. Okay, there are different themes that we can explore into. And of course, the most popular among teenagers is the theme about love. Or it could be theme about death. Or it could be theme about friendship. Or it could be about family. Or it could be anything about life. After all, literature is the study of life. Okay, so those are the different things that you have to consider when you are going to write your poem. Okay, before we're going to write our very own poem or the first poem that you are going to submit in this subject, we're going to analyze a certain poem and practice or identify the different literary device and the different elements that are used in writing that poem. But that is something that we're going to discuss for the next meeting. Okay, so I'm going to discuss that in the next video. For the meantime, I hope that I have helped you review the different elements of literature, I mean the different elements of poetry that you need to consider when you start writing your poem. Okay, once you understand all of those and familiarize them, then there is 100% guarantee that you can write your own poem without a hassle. That's all for today. Thank you and have a great day. And by the way, if you have questions or clarification, please feel free to ask them by leaving your comment below. Or you can also directly message me on my Facebook account. Once again, thank you. Have a great day. Goodbye.